Good morning, Dana. This is a conversation I have been excited to have, and so I'm glad to have this chance to connect. Now, obviously, this is an important topic to discuss, given the current state of the Earth and the current state of the population from a health perspective. I think what drew me to want to talk to you specifically about this topic is the fact that you're a researcher, not just an MD or a health coach. And I think that is important because it provides the audience and the listeners and myself with a perspective that I think a lot that they will tend to get from doctors and, again, health coaches that that's maybe just outside of the ordinary. So, I'm excited to have this conversation, like I said. Before we dive into the meat and potatoes of it, though, would you mind just running us through who you are, your story, how you got into research, how you got interested in this topic, and all that good stuff?
Yeah, hi again. Good morning, everyone. My name is Dana. I'm from Kazakhstan. I did my bachelor's in civil environmental engineering. Maybe a bit of background because why I chose environmental science in general is that my family is from the Aral Sea. It's the region in Kazakhstan where a huge environmental disaster took place in the 60s. It was once one of the largest lakes in the world, but because of human activities and the mismanagement of water for the irrigation purposes, we lost 90% of it right now. So only 10%
Wow.
of this lake is left right now. And of course, it affected the environment around, such a huge biodiversity loss. Of course, the humans were affected as well because a lot of people relied on this lake as a source of income, as a source of food for fishing. And now that this lake does not exist almost, of course, a lot of people lost their jobs and lost their main food source. And another thing is the environmental problems that came with it. Of course, if you lose a huge amount of water, it will alter your climate in the region, as well as there were a lot of chemicals that were dumped into that lake. And while water were like acted as a buffer for this chemical, now that this lost, all these chemicals were left in the sediments. And now that this water is no longer there, they can be easily picked up by the wind and transferred around the area, and that resulted in increase of cancer rates, increase of asthma rates, all the respiratory diseases. And I was personally affected by it because my family is from there. I have a lot of relatives who suffered from cancer. My father, my sister, they have asthma. All of us, we have allergies. So I think that was like the first reason for me to be interested in environmental science. I wanted to solve these problems and not let anything like this happen again. I started my bachelor's in civil environmental engineering, and I started working as a research assistant. And my professor at that time, he told me about microplastics. Like, this is the very new topic, very hot topic. I've heard of it before, but wasn't really interested in that because we don't study microplastics in environmental science because it's such a new topic. And when I started reading about it, I was so shocked about the information I read because first, microplastics are absolutely everywhere. Like wherever scientists try to look for them, they find it. And the lack of regulation is there as well. And such an understudied topic, still a lot of to discover. And yeah, that's how I basically started my research on microplastics.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I'd just like to inquire a bit more about this lake. It just shows my sort of complete arrogance and sort of ignorance in this field. But you said it started to be effective it started to be affected in the 1960s. Was that correct?
Yeah, during Soviet Union.
Okay, specifically how was it affected to the point where it started to effectively, for the want of a better word, shrink? I mean, again, I'm just just ignorant here, but what effectively led it to the point where it sort of deteriorated to the point where it is now?
Yeah, it was fairly simple. The government just diverted the rivers that fed the lake. I mean, it was logical to even understand, like, if you divert the river that feeds the lake will evaporate. Yeah, and they diverted a lot of water for the cotton irrigation, cotton fields irrigation, and yeah.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Thank you so for elaborating on that. I suppose I really can't get through a podcast without going on at least one tangent, so I'm going to try and get this one out of the way quickly. So I had this theory, and this is just obviously very broadly speaking, and it's a layman's theory, so take it with a pinch of salt, that we fundamentally as a species aren't doing the planet that much harm, and that ultimately we're just really working to finish ourselves off. I know that's a bit of a hot take, and again, it's just my opinion, but again, when you sort of just look at sort of evolution and history and how sort of resilient the planet is, it's my feeling that ultimately what we're doing to the planet is, yeah, just creating an environment that is just driving an inability to sustain life, especially human life. And that ultimately we will get to the point where we create such a hostile environment that we will not be able to fundamentally survive, but that ultimately the planet will then regain homeostasis and, yeah, maybe it'll take 10,000 years, but that ultimately it will be okay. I know there's a lot of back and forth and climate change and all of that. And again, this is just my hot take, something I'm not really qualified to speak on. But what do you sort of think of that as a whole? Do you think we really are sort of damaging the planet irrevocably, that word, or will it ultimately be okay and we're just ultimately going to damage ourselves?
It's such a difficult question, to be honest. I feel like part of it might be true that, yeah, you're completely right. Like, the planet is very resilient, and after the damage is done, and if we will not continue damaging it, it will come back to other state, where humans cannot exist, but other animals might thrive. Um, but I don't know, honestly. Well, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't do
Yeah,
anything. Like,
of
of course,
course.
we still need to. I mean, it's good to think of humans and nature working together in order to nature and both us to, yeah, thrive and to have good life, and yeah.
Yeah, okay. Fair enough. Okay. I'll try and get us back on topic and we can get back to microplastics. Okay, so before we sort of dive in any further, maybe you could give us an understanding of what microplastics are. I know it might seem like a bit of a basic question, but I think when most people think of microplastics, they tend to think of it at a macro level to begin with. And I know it sort of goes beyond that, and you get sort of primary and you get secondary sources of these plastics, all of which have differing sort of impacts on the environment. So yeah, if you could just help us to sort of understand what they are, and then maybe we can go from there. So yeah, the floor is yours.
Hmm. So you're right. Microplastics are just plastic particles, but very, very small. To be precise, its size should be less than 5 millimeters to be considered as microplastics. And yeah, there are primary and secondary microplastics. But if we also look at the chemical structures, there are a lot of different polymer types when it comes to plastic. I know people usually know 7 types, but there are much more. I mean, I can name at least 15 or 20, but I don't know all of them. So there are definitely more of them. And to say which one specifically does what impact, it's really difficult because, again, the chemical structure is different. So it might have different effects. And it's actually a bit of a challenge in microplastics research as well, because since they are different, but we, research them as like one thing, it could be a bit hard to drive conclusions. But at the same time, you cannot just differentiate between everything and research one specific, because in the environment it's already all of these polymer types, they are present. Of course, some have more microplastics, some have polymers are less in the environment. What is another thing, important point and very interesting point, is that microplastics itself, while they're considered inert, meaning they don't react chemically, don't readily react with other chemicals. The thing is, we also add a lot of chemicals during the production. Not only for example, polyethylene is not just pure polyethylene, because we also add flame retardants, bisphenol A, PFAS, and all the other chemicals that need to be added for the certain features or certain features of the final product. And that's again another issue, because then different microplastics will not only be different in their polymer types, in their chemical structure, but also because of these chemicals that were added into it. And we also name our microplastics as a cocktail of chemicals, because not only it has chemicals on the surface of it that we intentionally added, but also when it is in the environment, it can easily absorb different chemicals that is in the environment. So it again creates a big challenge for the research, because again, there's these chemicals that were intentionally added, then all the chemicals that it collected through its way, and then you have this cocktail of chemicals, and every cocktail will be different, because you don't know what is going to pick up. And like that's a big challenge in the research. And that's another thing why we cannot say, like, if you have microplastics, then you will have this and this effect, because it will be very individual based. And there's still a lot of research to be done. But when it comes to what kind of polymer types you should avoid or you should not be worried about it's a difficult question. Yeah.
Of course, yeah. And you sort of, I think you've already alluded to it, but is that sort of the primary difference between, well, primary and secondary microplastics? Are primary ones, from what I understand, there are microplastics that are sort of intentionally produced. And would those be things like your BPAs just for industrial purposes, and then your secondary ones being the result of breakdown from the primary? Is that correct? And sort of, I suppose, just for my own selfish interests, which ones generally pose more of an issue when we start talking about the consequences of having too much of these sort of primary or secondary ones in the environment?
Mm-hmm. I would say more or less the same, but the more problems will be with the secondary ones, because the primary ones, they are usually used for the personal care products, like microplastics that were intentionally produced to be small. They're usually used in the personal care products, not more or less not anything else. So they tend to be more less dangerous. Um, and for the secondary, they break down from larger plastic objects, and then you don't know what it gone through. Again, it could have transpired in a lot of different areas before it came to you. And in these areas, it could pick up so many different chemicals that you don't know what's effect going to be of this.
That sort of secondary accumulation, as it was. Cool. Thanks for that. Maybe it's just a case of me not being very bright, but I do like to sort of ask guests sort of these sorts of questions. It just helps to provide a firm grasp on the basic concepts. I'd love to say that my follow-up question is maybe a bit more intelligent. It's probably not. However, I'd like to ask sort of the most common sources of microplastics. Again, it's a basic question, but I think what most people think of when they think of microplastics is, well, that cheap plastic water bottle that you have sitting in the back of your car when it's 45 degrees Celsius and you are leaching BPAs and Lord knows what else into the water, or microwaving your meal in a plastic container. Of course, there's more to it than that. And until recently, I never thought about it. But things like synthetic clothing, I believe, are a major source of microplastics. So yeah, would you sort of mind educating myself and the listeners on the known sources, and then maybe the sources that might surprise people that people don't think of when thinking of microplastic exposure?
Hmm. That's a good question, actually. And yeah, microplastic, they were already found in everywhere. They're in our water, in our air, even in our bodies already. But when we talk about like the highest exposure, it's going to be everything that's related to your kitchen, to your food. So if you have plastic there, especially the ones that exposed to heat, if you have like containers that you put in the microwave, or you have this plastic utensils you use when you cook, they will release a lot of microplastics, like billions or trillions of it. Um, yeah, as you said, another thing is plastic water bottles. Yeah, basically anything that's plastic, that it will release microplastics. One of the more or less shocking sources that were shocking, at least for me, it's tea bags, because bags can be made of synthetic material as well, like from plastic. And even those that are made with paper, they are using sometimes plastic as an adhesive, so it will not break the paper, and it can release like billions of microplastics. In one study, they found like 4.5 billions of microplastics from one tea bag, and it's a huge source. Another thing is coffee pods. They can also be from synthetics. Another shocking, it's chewing gum, because chewing gum is just a flavored rubber. They use plastic as a base for chewing gum, so it's basically like chewing plastic. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think it sort of just highlights the fact that so many of these compounds are sort of really they become more of an issue when heat is involved, especially yeah things that you would normally think not to be an issue. So from my understanding, having your food in or as an example, in a plastic container is not necessarily as much of an issue as when it is heated. And I think obviously heat liberates a lot of these plastics. So that's probably maybe the one takeaway that people should maybe start looking at, is to sort of try and sort of not ingest anything that has been heated in plastic.
Hmm. and that
Um,
and that
mhm.
involves paper cups as well, because
Oh,
paper
yes.
cups, yeah, they are lined with plastic.
Yeah, I think so. And you sort of, I mean, you go down that rabbit hole and it gets so tricky, doesn't it? It's like, well, what else is lined in plastic? Your sardine cans, your soda cans,
Yeah,
and everything.
exactly.
Um, I know for you sort of talk a lot about the fashion industry and all of that. It was that born out of a sort of a curiosity from microplastics as well, looking at sort of sustainable clothing. I know your Instagram, I follow, yeah, is heavily about that component as well. Would you sort of mind elaborating on that aspect of it?
For sure. So when I did my research back in Kazakhstan, we did research on wastewater treatment plant. We wanted to see like the what kind of microplastics, if there are microplastics in the wastewater, and what kind of microplastics. And we found that there are a lot of polyester fibers, and we think it's from clothes. So, like a huge percentage of microplastics that in the wastewater are from clothes, because when you do the laundry, then it's easy for the microplastics to shed, and then it all goes into our water. And this water is not specifically treated for microplastics. Like, not only in Kazakhstan, anywhere in the world, there are no specific equipments that remove microplastics, and it's not monitored the amount of microplastics. So you can easily discharge how many microplastics you want. So when I saw this, I was like, okay, polyester, it's clothes. And I wanted to check my clothes. And a lot of them were made from synthetic materials, not only polyester, but polyamide, acrylics, nylon, and everything, like spandex, everything. Yeah, it was plastic. And I didn't like it. I didn't want to contribute to that. But when I started researching about fashion as well, like 60%, nearly 70% of all clothes produced right now are made with synthetic materials, which is huge. So I understood, like, yeah, fashion is another huge source of microplastics in the environment, in our bodies, probably. So for me, it's also important to address these issues. And there's a lot of issue with fast fashion as well, not only the environmental problems, but also like social problems, with underpaid workers and stuff like this. But yeah, when I understood that fashion has this much of an impact, especially to plastic pollution, I tried to speak of it. Yeah.
Fair enough. You mentioned fast fashion. Not a term I'm familiar with. Sorry. Well, I mean, look at me. I'm hardly. I don't. I don't understand fashion at the best of times. So, as long as the colors vaguely match, I'm happy. Um, but yeah, that specifically that term. What do you mean by fast fashion?
Fast fashions are like the brands that produce a lot of clothes, like
Okay.
very, they set up the trends, or whenever they see the trends they produce clothes. So for fast fashions, for fast fashion brands, I think they can produce a clothes from design to production in 2 weeks, which is crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's yeah. That's definitely something. I think, sort of to summarize all of that, to say that microplastics are sort of ubiquitous in our environment is a bit of an understatement.
Hmm.
I'd sort of like to segue into talking about how they particularly sort of affect the environment, though. Again, when I think of microplastics in the environment, I sort of think of, again, from a very macro perspective. So your sort of plastic bags usually see slowly deteriorating in landfills or in oceans. And I think of, I mean, technically things like crude oil spills and all of that. So you look at it very much, again, from a layman's perspective. Um, but would you be able to sort of provide us with more of an understanding of what these plastics are doing to the environment, especially at a sort of commercial level?
Hmm. Yeah, if we don't talk about plastic, but microplastics specifically,
Yeah,
um, there's a lot of them in our water for sure. I think I've read like by 2050 there will be more microplastics particles than there's fish in the water, and that's already concerning. But another thing is how they affect the environment, because that's what's important, right? I mean, even if they are out there but they're not doing anything, then we are okay. But it does something to our environment, which is not good. um, One of the things is that very small fish, they cannot easily differentiate between microplastics and, plankton or something like this, very small. So they tend to feed on these microplastics, and since microplastics have no nutrition and nothing like um, this can lead to malnutrition in fish and eventually death. That's like for the fish and birds as well. It's the same. Another thing is different plants. There's a very recent paper I read about how microplastics hinder the photosynthesis. It can lower the photosynthesis rate by 7-12% in marine algae, in aquatic plants, in different crops, different major crops. And that's not only bad for the environment, which is already bad for the environment, but it's also bad for us because we need these crops, and no photosynthesis means no yield practically. And it can result in a huge food reduction in, yeah, it's a threat to our food security, because this 7-12% means less, like no 7 to 12% reduction in yield as well. And if we don't lower our microplastics pollution, then this number will only going to rise, and eventually we will have less and less yields, which is very concerning. uh yeah.
yeah. And sort of just at a high level, I suppose beyond just maybe the social side of it, do you think microplastics are sort of contributing to sort of climate change in any particular way?
I would say it's plastic that, in general, contributes to climate change. When it comes to microplastic, it's hard, but I could say that microplastics they were actually found in the clouds, and they have some effects on the clouds as well. I'm not very sure what kind of effect, but I mean, there could be some climate change effect of that, but I would say it's mainly plastic that rather than microplastic that contribute to climate change.
Fair enough. And maybe just to follow up on that, just with regards to their breakdown, do we have any data to show that microplastics actually degrade, if ever, or they just build up and sort of become more of an issue over time?
I mean, it does degrade, but it does it in a very, very slow rate. So, I mean, it takes like around 80, 100 years for plastic to fully degrade. From the good side, from the bright side and good news, we actually found some fungi. Um, Also, we found some microbes that or enzymes that can actually break down microplastics into like hydrogen and carbon and oxygen. Uh, yeah. But that's not at the rate that we would like it to be.
Yeah, no, that was going to be one of my follow-up questions I was going to ask in a minute. Was just this. I did some basic research the other day looking into this, and just I think there are various species of aspergillus that I believe are involved in this breakdown of plastics. Would you sort of can you speak to that at all? If is it something you're familiar with? How do you have an idea of how these fungi potentially are helping to break down these components?
I didn't study it. I just know like the general information, to be honest. But what I've read, I think for some enzymes that they found, they somehow also altered these enzymes in some kind of
Okay.
way, the scientists, so that it would be possible for them to degrade this plastic. Or was it fungi or mushrooms? Yeah, one of them. It was with the help of the scientists. So
Okay.
they added something. I'm not really familiar what was that, but it helped these organisms to degrade these plastics.
Fair enough. Um, okay, so obviously climate change is an issue, and I think that people can identify with uh, climate change in the sense that they well obviously it's broadcast all over the news, but it's not something that people notice on a day-to-day basis, unless they sort of have an iceberg maybe melting in their driveway, which I don't suppose many people do. I think it's sort of in that sense it's easier to sort of see microplastics as being an issue, just because again, like I mentioned earlier, are so sort of ubiquitous in our environment now. um, I suppose I'd just sort of like to sort of segue from that into sort of talking about what we can do about this issue. Obviously, there are there are there are various strategies people can utilize. For example, just not buying as many plastic containing products. But beyond that, what can people really start to do at an individual level to reduce this problem that we have in society as a whole?
hmm First, I would say is not to freak out about the problem. I mean, stressing out and being anxious about this is counter intuitive or
Yeah,
contradicting with the efforts to try to solve this. So yeah, don't freak out. It's okay. We still have a lot of time. And I also wanted to add, I had this one guy who worked on the technology that removes microplastics, and he told me like we are at the historical moment of like it's the first time ever when we noticed the problem before it made a big mess. So we still
Okay.
have a lot of time, and we are this historical moment where we can definitely do make a big change, a big impact. Because for example, with climate change, we noticed it very late, and yeah, we noticed this after only after it already did a lot of problems. But with microplastic, we still have a lot of time to solve this problem. Yeah, so don't freak out. This second thing is to read about it, educate yourself about the microplastics problem, not only like for yourself, but for later. If you're gonna advocate for changes, advocate for regulations, you will need this information to fully understand the extent of the problems and what are some things that to be concerned about. Is it something like we need to remove microplastics from the environment, or we need to focus on the plastic production to limit it, or even the intentional addition of microplastics into our personal care products. So yeah, you should understand what are the sources, where it come from, and yeah, and where it leads you, as well as for the like policy regulations. And yeah, of course, one of the things we need to do is like limit your plastic and stuff like this. But another thing that should go hand in hand with limiting your plastic is, of course, demanding the changes, demanding the regulations, because right now there is a huge lack of regulations when it comes to microplastics. Of course, because it's from one point is that the problem is very new. Like plastic, it became a thing only like 80 years ago. And for microplastics, like 20 years ago that we discovered them. So yeah, but there is this still a huge lack of regulation, like in every country of the world, even in developed countries, in developed regions. So, of course, voting for those who care about the environment is very important. Voting with your dollar when you shop
Yeah.
at certain stores and you don't shop at others. And yeah, there are some petitions going on. I know there are a lot of, not a lot of, but some advocacy groups that also asking for the regulations of microplastic and plastic, like Story of Stuff. Maybe you know them. Yeah, they're doing a great job in advocating for this regulation of plastic waste, and plastic production. Yeah, so yeah, keep educating yourself, keep searching for the information. There's already more or less a lot of information about microplastics. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think it just comes ultimately down to caring enough and then educating yourself enough, and to sort of misquote Mahatma Gandhi, sort of being the change you want to see. I think that's important. Um, of course, I suppose the biggest problem is, again, is sort of is at a governmental level, and creating that policy that's needed. Um, are there any sort of at a state level, are there any governments that are taking this seriously just yet, or is it sort of really seen as a secondary problem, maybe to the plastic issue as a whole? Can you expand or speak to that at all?
I can tell about the situation in Europe, in European Union. So there
Please.
are, yeah, there are
Mhm.
regulations under REACH. They are trying to introduce a lot of regulations regarding microplastics, uh, mainly those microplastics that are intentionally added in the personal care products. So I think in the course of 10, 15 years, they will, yeah, ban these microplastics from personal care products. Yeah, another thing, maybe in 20, 30 years, that will be a case that they will also introduce the regulations on discharge of microplastics. So, like different wastewater treatment plants, they will have to monitor for microplastics, and if they are not passing the certain amount, certain limit, they can be discharged into water. But if not, they will need to cleanse it again from microplastics specifically.
Yeah. Do
Um,
you think?
mhm.
Sorry. Do you think banning sort of single-use plastics would help at all?
I think yes. I think like single-use plastic might be a very major source of plastics, of microplastics as well. If I'm not wrong, I think around 40% of all plastic comes from plastic packaging. So ultimately, plastic packaging is something that you use more or less one time. Uh, so yeah, for sure, single-use plastic is not something that we need, like really need. I mean, it can be easily swapped by reusables. When it comes to plastic water bottles, you can go for reusable water bottle and stuff like this. The only thing that is concerning might be is the science and medicine fields, because they rely a lot on single-use stuff, especially plastic, because it's cheap and affordable, and it's what made science and medicine affordable for everyone.
Yeah, I think again it just comes down to this issue of convenience. Obviously, not taking into account what you've just mentioned about the medical system, but I think people like the convenience of single-use plastics. They like the convenience of plastics in general, don't they? And it speaks to a whole bunch of issues. I fall into the camp that non-native EMFs are potentially harmful for human health as well. So things like Wi-Fi may potentially be causing a lot of systemic illness. But when you sort of start looking at the issues around Wi-Fi, one of the biggest sort of challenges you run into is the convenience of Wi-Fi, and sort of the idea that you then have to sort of plug everything into your router using cables really puts people off. And obviously that same logic sort of carries over to your Starbucks plastic cups and everything else. So um, it's almost like it has to get to a point where it becomes so unbearable that you are almost forced into making the right decision, if that makes sense. Um, but I mean, hopefully, with podcasts like this and information like this, people will just start to become more aware. And yeah, I think when it starts to affect someone's health, they're more inclined to want to make a change as well, which is unfortunate, but the truth. I think it, but it again just comes down to educating people on those topics so that they are aware of the potential implications of utilizing these plastics in their day-to-day life. Dana, I'd love to sort of pivot into talking about how these molecules affect human health, if that's okay. So based on what you've already told us, people tend to accumulate microplastics mainly through what they eat, what they drink, maybe to a lesser extent through their clothing. Um, and again, yeah, definitely through what they sort of inhale through the air, depending on where they live. I think what most people miss is that uh, car tires, for example, produce a lot of sort of rubber that I think gets aerosolized and can also create a lot of issues as well. Um, but beyond that, of course, where they're being sourced from, can you speak to how these plastics are affecting our biology at a cellular level? Of course, there's the endocrine aspect of it, but at a cellular level itself, do you know or have feeling of what these compounds are doing?
Mhm. So a bit of a disclaimer. Microplastic is still topic that is researched. We still need a lot of research and a lot of time to specifically say what are the human health effects that is done by microplastics.
Yeah.
From some research that I've read, microplastics are small enough to enter the cells, and they have this ability. They have the ability to cross the blood-brain barrier as well. And yeah, they're essentially in our blood and in most of our organs, if not in all of them. So when it comes to cells, I know that microplastics might cause inflammation and oxidative stress. But this is something that is still we need to research more in order to say yes, that's 100% true. As well as there are other effects of microplastics, like because you can inhale it, there could be some respiratory problems like asthma, or yeah, or just like coughing or just irritating your lungs, as well as it goes into your brain. And there was a recent research that the amount of microplastic doubled from 2016, from 2016 to 2024. The amount of microplastics in our brains doubled in concentration, and already our brains are 0.5% of microplastics.
Yeah. Now, I think it's important to note that, as you said, that we're still sort of trying to evaluate the sort of the clinical outcomes of what these compounds are doing. Like you said, they definitely do increase oxidative stress within cells, particularly reactive oxygen species. And as I'm sure you know, they then damage lipids, they damage proteins, and they affect DNA, which in turn affects metabolic function. I did some research into this as well, just in preparation for this podcast. And from what I learned mechanistically, they also sort of affect the immune cells and the immune system. And when they get into circulation, they start to trigger certain cells, such as macrophages, which in turn sort of drive excessive stimulation of the immune system. And this creates a lot of inflammation that then feeds back into the body and can create potentially various disease states. They also seem, there's some evidence to show that they can directly affect mitochondria as well. Our mitochondria don't have an immune system per se, but when mitochondria sense something is affecting them, what they tend to do is they tend to release a lot of byproducts. So things like cardiolipin, mitochondrial DNA into the cytosol and of the cell, and also to a lesser extent into circulation. This then again sort of starts to it results in an upregulation of that same upregulated immune response, and you have various immune cells, things like toll-like receptor 9 and the NLP3 inflammasome that are all activated, and it just feeds into this vicious inflammatory cycle within the body and within the cell, which then sort of consequently results in the mitochondria not being effective. And you run into problems, like I mentioned earlier, of metabolism and not being able to produce hormones effectively. And I think, it's speculatory, of course, but I do think that they are then able to epigenetically alter also human beings as well. Obviously, epigenetics being how specific genes are turned on and off in the body. But if you look at it from a mechanistic standpoint, there does seem to be some preliminary data to show that microplastics, by way of inflammation and excessive immune system activation, may trigger the overt expression of some genes that would otherwise lay dormant, and then create, or at least potentially drive, the formation of these sort of age-related diseases, or sort of speed them up, as it were. So they definitely are an issue, and it's a minefield. And I think it's why being educated around topics of toxic exposure is so important. And for that, I would invite the listeners to listen to the podcast we recently did with Dr. Jenny Goodman, who's she's a doctor, but she's got an interest in toxic exposure, broadly speaking, toxicology. She's based in the UK, and she's done a lot of work into this. Bit of a follow-up question, maybe something you can speak to. Do you think that microplastics are potentially some of the reason why we've got an issue with infertility in society today, why people are struggling to conceive?
Yeah, it might be definitely because microplastics were found in placenta, in testes, in sperm, and as well as microplastics. As I said, they have different chemicals, and some of the chemicals, like BPA, can be hormone disruptors. That is proved to be hormone disruptors. And imagine this microplastic with these hormone disrupting chemicals to be in our organs. Of course, it's going to affect us and our reproductive health as well. And while it might not be the only problem that's causing the reproductive health problems, but it might be one of them.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think that people, especially men, sort of look at every second guy that I know is hopping onto testosterone replacement therapy, but very few people are sort of willing to do the hard work to sort of try and identify, obviously talking about men in this case, why their testosterone may be low to begin with. And these same people who are getting onto TRT are still eating out of microwave plastic containers. And I've got a good few friends who are trying to conceive now and trying to start families and are running into issues. And of course, we can't sort of directly say that this is the only reason. But again, if you sort of look at it logically and you look at the mechanistic data, it does seem to definitely be a contributing factor. I think, and again, just speculating here, but I believe anyway that there could be some issues surrounding, specific issues regarding diseases like cancer, things like that, maybe metabolic diseases as well, especially in women, where estrogen plays such an important role in the development of things like breast cancer. And when you have these microplastics sort of mimicking a lot of what estrogen can do in the body, it's just going to make those issues more and more prevalent. So it's definitely something that we just sort of need to be aware of as a society and start to sort of try and understand. Anyway, sorry, another tangent there. Right. So obviously, GI issues are a major problem for millions of people. And with the bulk of the immune system being found in the gut, there are potentially a lot of issues there as well with regards to microplastics. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that there's direct, at least published correlation there, but do you think that there's any link between maybe the accumulation of microplastics and things like gut dysbiosis, which is probably a whole separate topic in of itself?
Yeah, it could be as well. There are some papers because we eat a lot of microplastics, like
Yeah.
that's for sure. As I said, they're in the water, and even if you try to avoid plastic, you will still be exposed to microplastic and to eating it. So of course we have some concentration of microplastics in our guts, and microplastic can have all of these chemicals that are not supposed to be in our guts, and it could uh, have some effects as well as like microbiome imbalances. There's even like some paper that says that in order, like one of the way to detox from microplastics is to eat yogurt or pickles, because they have all of these probiotics that help our guts as well. And they help sort of like detoxify the microplastics from the chemicals.
Yeah. No, it's definitely an interesting area again. I think, well, just based on what we discussed earlier about these various aspergillus strains and fungi and bacteria in general being able to sort of break down microplastics, it sort of does leave credence, leave. It does provide some evidence to suggest also that various bacteria can start to help to break them down. So by ingesting various different forms of probiotics, there may, again, just me speculating, be some at least mechanistic data or theories to suggest that maybe we can sort of alter our gut microbiome to potentially help to expunge or remove these plastics from our body, I suppose. Anyway, Donna, in a moment, I'd love to jump onto some rapid fire questions, but sort of before we get to that point, are there any emerging areas of research within this field that you're particularly excited about, that you feel would really help to sort of reduce the accumulation of microplastics in our environment?
Yeah, there are a lot. At least in Germany, we have a lot, like different startups and organizations that are working on the, um, like creating equipment and different techniques and tools in order to, remove microplastics, especially from water, because like most of microplastics, they end up eventually in the water. There are different equipments that are really fascinating. One of them is the um, micro bubbles. It's called micro bubbles. So they put micro bubbles. They introduce a lot of micro bubbles into the water, and since microplastics are hydrophobic, it means they don't like water. They would prefer to stick on these bubbles, and as these bubbles goes up, um, as the bubble goes up. All these microplastics are on the surface, so you can easily remove them. And there are a lot of like this very interesting equipment and new tools and techniques that can remove microplastics from our water. There's one that is done with chemicals, uh, with coagulation. So they add specific chemicals into the water, and this chemical can, collect all the microplastics on its way, and then it acts as a sediment, so it goes down. So there are a lot of different research that's going on to remove these microplastics. That's very interesting and so creative, to be honest. So
Yeah,
yeah, very excited to
yeah.
see what's gonna be in the future.
Yeah, no, it just sort of suggests that there is hope for us yet, I suppose, as long as we sort of take the basic steps of reducing our consumption of these or our use of these plastics. Donna, you've been a terrific guest. Thank you. Before I let you go, though, I'd love to do a quick lightning round, if that's okay. If you could remove one source of microplastics from the environment or from consumption, what would it be? What do you think is the biggest microplastic that is generally an issue?
Mhm. It's hard to even choose one because there's this one like microplastics from tires, because tires generate a lot of microplastics that then introduce into our water. But then there's fashion, because fashion is another huge source, and there's also other problems with fashion. Like I told, not only microplastic but the amount of clothes that are produced and polluting our world. And there's another one that is like plastic in our food, like plastic packaging, and all our food packaged in plastic. Probably I will go with the last one, like the food that is packaged in plastic. I feel like it could be unnecessary and at the same time generating a lot of microplastic that is directly enter our bodies. Yeah, so plastic packaging.
Perfect answer. Thank you. What's the one habit you've changed personally to reduce your plastic exposure?
Yeah, first thing that I looked into is my kitchen. So if I could, one of the first thing, I think it was the chopping board, because you could literally see when you use a plastic chopping board, you can literally see
Mhm.
these
Yeah.
microplastic particles generating when you cut something. And yeah, for me, it's something that is gross. So I choose right now only wooden chopping boards.
Yeah, no, when you see that, you cannot unsee it. It's scary.
Um,
And then you sort of, it's maybe one of the best representations of how much plastic you actually ingest is when you start seeing those little white, fine grains of plastic. And
mhm.
it's when you understand how dangerous these compounds can potentially be, it is scary.
Yeah.
Um, Maybe a controversial one. Do you think recycling works?
Yeah, it's a very controversial topic. I mean, it works to some extent, but it's not a solution at all. Like, it's not the first thing that we need to focus on. I mean, of course, we have a lot of plastic, so it needs to be recycled, but yeah, definitely not a solution.
What, in your view, is the industry that contributes most to the microplastic pollution issue?
Industry. Might be fashion. Yeah.
Dana, you, like I said, you've been an absolute star, and thank you so much for your time. Where can people find you? I know you're active on Instagram, obviously, but where would you like to sort of send people? Should they be interested in your work, and where can people connect with you if they want to find you or find out more about what you do?
Yeah, it's mainly Instagram. I also have TikTok and Threads, but yeah, I don't put as much effort there as I do on my Instagram. So yeah, it's better to connect there. I try to answer all of my DMs if possible. So if you have any questions, you can drop them.
Okay, perfect. Well, we'll be sure to link to your handle in the show notes. Dana, thank you so much for your time and again your patience. This has been a fascinating conversation. I definitely learned a lot, and I'm sure the audience did too. So, thank you.
Thank you for having me. Bye.